Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Birkbeck. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, which is based here at Birkbeck. And it's a particular pleasure that there are so many of you here this evening to hear our speaker, Lisa Leff. Lisa is professor of history at the American University in Washington, and her first book was on the rise of Jewish internationalism in 19th century France. That was published in 2006. She then published last year, in 2015, The Archive Thief, which is the basis for her talk this evening. It's an award-winning book. Lisa is the winner of the Sami Ruhr Prize for Jewish Literature, and she was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. So it's with great anticipation that I introduce Lisa to speak about The Archive Thief, the man who salvaged French Jewish history in the wake of the Holocaust. Lisa.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a cold night. So I first stumbled on the story that became this book, The Archive Thief, about 20 years ago when I was doing my dissertation research, actually. I was writing a dissertation on the Jews of modern France, and I was going, like any good graduate student, to the archive to find everything that there might be in Paris about the history of Jews in the 19th century in France. And when I started the research, it was basically, impossible. It was impossible not to notice that there were huge gaps in the archives. I would call things up, and the slips would come back, and it would say, like, ça manque à sa place, missing. And this happened enough times that I began to get curious about it. And first I blamed the archive, of course. But eventually I screwed up my courage and I asked the archivist, what's going on here? Why are so many things missing? And the story that I heard was incredible. The reason, he told me, the reason so many things were missing was that they had been stolen by a prominent Jewish historian who had been in the archives before me, a man named Szajkowski. And here's a picture of him from the 1950s. This is at the height of his career as a historian of Jews of modern France. What I heard was, and I heard this in the archives, that during the 1950s, Szajkowski stole widely across the French archives everything he could find related to the study of Jews in modern France. Then he brought all of that stuff back to New York, where he was based. He wrote articles based on it. And then eventually, when he was done with it, he sold the material off to American Jewish research collections. And eventually, I learned, collections in Israel as well. Eventually, his story turned tragic. In 1978, he was caught red-handed stealing precious, rare pamphlets from the New York Public Library, which was just down the street from where he lived. And in the wake of that scandal, he committed suicide. So I should tell you why this story grabbed my attention so much when I first heard it. And it was because I had already heard of Szajkowski. I knew the name quite well. Before I ever heard that he was an archive thief. And that was because no one could ever do research in the field of French Jewish history without encountering the many, many articles, over 200 articles that he had written. He started publishing back in the 1940s when almost no one was working professionally in this field. You had a few rabbis working on individual communities, but you didn't have any academic Jewish history until Szajkowski. He published in 5 languages. He published everywhere. And even today, those articles which he published over a number of decades are still considered essential in the field. Anyone doing work in this field uses it. Now, I should also say he's rather unusual. Like many Jewish historians of his day, so working in the 1940s and 50s, he never actually held an academic post, and we'll talk more about that later, about why that was. But still today, if you work on anything from Jews in the French Revolution or Jews in the 18th century or even Jews in the Holocaust in France, he's considered a founding father of these fields. And yet, and this is what got me, right? What I learned in the archive was that all of those studies were actually based on documents that he stole, used for his research, and eventually sold to other research collections where I, among others, had seen them in the United States. So this kind of just got my curiosity going. And my book really began as a quest to get to the bottom of this question. Why would a respected historian like Szajkowski, why would he have done this, right? What kind of disrespect for the archive, what kind of passion would lead someone to do this? And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized there's a second question bound up in that first that you need to answer if you're going to understand this man. And it's this. Why would the libraries have let this happen? Because if you think about it, right, however pathological or criminal Szajkowski's actions were, and I hope I'll convey to you tonight that they were both pathological and criminal, he never would have stolen so widely and over such a long period of time if there hadn't been willing buyers. So you have to understand why these libraries were willing buyers if you're going to understand him. So it's these two intertwined stories that I want to tell you tonight. Okay, so the story begins in Poland in the 1930s when a young Szajkowski first got interested in Jewish archives and Jewish history. Szajkowski himself was in fact born in Poland in 1911, but he came to France as a young man in 1927, simply seeking, like so many other Polish Jews in that era, simply seeking a better life. He was very poor back in Poland. His family was very poor. And many Jews in his position, or at least those who had some gumption, were emigrating. And there was a large community of Polish Jews at this time in the late 1920s in the city of Paris, and among them his older brothers, who were all working in the garment industry. And that's where he began. When he arrived, he started working as a furrier and later in a watch factory. But then by the mid-1930s, by 1934, you actually see him making a career switch, a rather unusual career switch. He had become a writer. And by 1934, he's regularly writing for this newspaper, the Naya Pressa, which is the communist Yiddish language daily in Paris in the 1930s. And then by the late 1930s, like within a few years, by 1937, he'd made yet another about-face, maybe less extreme than the first, but in his own biography, the way he understood his life, a radical break. In 1937, he broke with the Communist Party and instead turned to a different kind of writing, academic style, though outside of the academy, Jewish history, based on sources. So 2 conversions, right? One to writing, and then a second to history. Why? This is something I got really interested in because it's actually pretty rare for people of his background who grew up as poor as he did, and for people within the Communist Party in this time, in the 1930s, to turn to scholarship. So seeing that was pretty unusual, I began to investigate the milieu in which he made this second conversion to history. And it all had to do with an encounter he had with people who became like surrogate parents to him, mentors. These two, Elias and Riva Cherikover, also immigrants from Eastern Europe, but they're a generation older than Szajkowski. And Cherikover, Elias Cherikover, was the head of the historical section of YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which had been founded in Vilna in 1925. But even though the main office of YIVO was in Vilna, Cherikover himself, and with his wife, were living in Paris, and that's where Szajkowski met them. And it was the passion that Cherikover had and the kind of mission that he saw for scholarship that inspired Szajkowski to leave behind communism and journalism and turn instead to scholarship. For these people brought to scholarship all of the conviction and all of the sense of purpose that any card-carrying member of the Communist Party brought to their political work. So it's a very different kind of scholarship than we have today. And it comes completely out of their own experiences. So the Cherikovers were born in the early 1880s in the Russian Empire, in the area around Kiev. And what they saw in their lifetime made them devoted scholars. And here's what they had seen. As young people, they'd been actually socialists, but very committed also to a kind of Jewish nationalism. When they looked around them, kind of at the turn of the century, what they saw happening in their Jewish world was a very exciting moment of modernization that they thought had massive perils. They saw Jews moving to cities, abandoning traditional ways of life, abandoning religion, and they saw a great danger in all of this, that Jews might just move to cities and forget who they were and not be able to face challenges with all the strength that you have when you know where you come from. So they actually got devoted to Jewish scholarship as part of these larger projects to collect and record all of the evidence about Jewish life that was kind of falling away, right? The old traditions that were being forgotten. So they're, in the pre-World War I era, they're already part of these projects to collect old, circumcision records and marriage records and all of these things that were being left behind in the old towns and bring them to an archive, right? Collect them so that Jewish scholars could study them and write about them and know what kind of people they came from, right? If Jews aren't going to continue to practice religion traditionally, at least they should know what that was like and be able to study it. So in this sense, their initial devotion, what they're bringing to Jewish scholarship and Jewish history, is actually the passion of Jewish nationalism, right? It's a very modern response to all of this change. Jews should know where they come from. We should study the past. And there's another part of what they were up to that's also important to know about, which is that for them, this collecting and this scholarship is also part of the politics of Jewish self-defense. Because here's the other important moment in the Cherikovers' life. And it's this. I think I already mentioned that they were socialists, and they actually were very happy about the Russian Revolution when it happened. But in the wake of the Russian Revolution, the region that they lived in, Ukraine, was beset by this terrible wave of pogroms, the Ukrainian pogroms, that at the time that they happened were perceived by the people who were living there as totally unprecedented. There had been pogroms before, but now the scale, in the hundreds of thousands of Jews hurt, it was just on a totally new scale, and it felt unprecedented. And in fact, these are the kinds of words that people at the time used. Language that we actually normally associate with the Holocaust. People talked about the Ukrainian pogroms that way. And in seeing these atrocities all around them, the Cherikovers' response and that of the people around them was to document. These were people already committed to archives. They already had made their life creating archives, and now they respond to tragedy by creating archives. They went all around with a group. They went all around the region of the Ukraine collecting testimonies and gathering them together into what's today known as the Ukrainian Pogrom Archive. Initially, I think the hope was that there would be a trial. And they took their archive, which was the kind of material you would use in a trial. And they took it to Moscow with the expectation that, there's a new government, it's outlawing anti-Semitism, surely there will be justice. We're bringing the evidence, objectively collected with completely scholarly methods. And I see some heads shaking. Some of you know what actually did happen, which was nothing in the Soviet Union. But for the Cherkovers, it meant flight. They left behind the Soviet Union and they went to where they thought would be their future home, where they could at least make knowledge of this available to the West, and maybe there would be a different kind of justice. So they went to where they thought would be the capital of Jewish civilization, Berlin, in 1920, and they started compiling their Ukrainian Pogrom Archive into a series of books that they were going to publish, again, to make all of this known in the West. They didn't get that far into their planned 7 volumes. They worked through a couple and planned the whole thing. And that's what they were doing in 1933 when Hitler came to power, and they fled yet again to Paris. And it's in the wake of that they form in Paris a kind of circle of people like them who weren't academics. They weren't in universities, but they were learned Jews committed to Jewish nationalism and Jewish self-defense at a time where they thought they were facing the worst challenges in Jewish history, right? So basically, they lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the 15th arrondissement of Paris that was filled from floor to ceiling with books and papers and their Ukrainian Pogrom Archive and other stuff that they were collecting that documented the life of Jewish immigrants and the history of Jews in France, which had never been documented before in a scholarly way. Interestingly, French Jews hadn't done it. And they'd gathered around them kind of this circle of Yiddish speakers who were starting to publish in Yivo's journal back in Vilna all sorts of articles that documented the history of Jews in France in Yiddish. So now, if you want to study the history of Jews in France, now you got to learn Yiddish first. And this was the intellectual milieu where a young Szajkowski got excited enough to abandon the Communist Party and say, for the Jewish future, the communists aren't going to do it. The communists don't have Jewish interests at heart. This is my new political cause. And it's not traditional politics. It's a new kind of politics. It's scholarship. And it's this that's going to save the Jewish people. And that's what he was so excited about in 1939 when war broke out. But war, of course, broke up this circle of Yiddish-speaking scholars in Paris, and the Cherkovers were lucky enough very early in 1940 to get a visa to go to New York because Yivo had another branch office in New York. So the New Yorkers were able to sponsor the Cherkovers to get out. And once they got to New York, they were able to sponsor Szajkowski, who arrived in New York in September 1941, one of the latest boats that you could possibly get in. And once he arrived, he did some scholarship for Yivo, but relatively quickly, he decided he couldn't stay away from Europe and returned as soon as the Americans entered the war. So Szajkowski returns to Europe, first to England for training, and then he winds up getting connected to a unit of paratroopers. This is the famous 82nd Airborne that parachuted into Normandy on the night before D-Day. He worked with the paratroopers through 1944 and into the beginning of 1945. And he worked, like many of these immigrants who signed up for the US Army, he worked as a translator, right? And he's a natural for it because he is fluent in French and sort of English. His English is good enough. But also because of his Yiddish, they can use him to talk to Germans. And they learned pretty quickly that because of his Polish background, he actually can speak Polish quite well. He speaks Polish perfectly, but it also means that he has some facility in Russian, which I didn't actually know this till I wrote this book, which actually came in quite handy in the D-Day landing, because did you know that the first soldiers that many of these Allied soldiers encountered, many of the German soldiers that they encountered, were in fact Russian and Polish POWs fighting for the Germans, conscripted into the German army. So much of his translating was actually from Russian and Polish. While he was doing all of this interpreting work, and while he's at the front risking his life, his commitment to collecting remained as strong as ever. So even when he's in military uniform, what is he thinking when he's on the ground in France? He's thinking, I must document. When he was in France, the stuff that he was interested in was documents that would tell us something about the experience of French Jews under German occupation. So it's from him that we have these tremendous collections of underground newspapers that were very rare. And also, all of this stuff, he gathered it up and sent it to YIVO in New York so that it could be there and could be studied, right? And then the other thing that he got that's been of great value to historians is the papers of the UJIF, which is the organization that was a Jewish organization in France that answered to the authorities, okay? So this organization at the end of the war, it was a kind of umbrella organization that brought together all the diverse Jewish organizations in order to deal with the authorities. At the end of the war, as you might imagine, no Jewish leader wanted to take responsibility for these papers, because as soon as liberation happened, they all said, it wasn't me, right? They were nervous that it might look like they had collaborated. So Szajkowski told his friends back in New York, the Cherikovers, that he found these papers abandoned in a basement in Marseille. We'll never know if that's true. But we do know that he sent them, and that he continued to send them over a number of years. And this is why the papers of this organization are not in France, or most of them are not in France, but are instead in New York at YIVO. It's because Szajkowski took them. In the summer of 1945, so after victory, Szajkowski was reassigned. So he wasn't sent home. He was instead sent to Berlin, again to work as an interpreter, because at Allied command in Berlin, you had the Russians, the Americans, the English, and the French. And of course, all of the citizens of Berlin speak German. So you needed someone with his kind of language capacity. He was quite valuable there. So he worked as an interpreter there from July 1st until the end of 1945. And there too, what do you think he did in his spare time, right? Other soldiers are going and consorting with women. He's always complaining like, oh, they're going off with the German women. Here's what Szajkowski's up to. Every spare moment that he can find, he's going into the bombed out ruins of these Nazi ministries to look for documents. And everything he could find, he sent to YIVO in New York. This is a photograph that I found in his papers at YIVO of him going through the propaganda ministry, which is the place where he got some of his very best stuff. And when I tell you he took stuff out, I should tell you it was a huge amount. He sent, in the 6 months that he was there, 2 to 3 packages per day. At a certain point, he wrote home to the Cherikovers, there is simply not enough string in Berlin to tie all the packages that I want to send. And he sent things like wrapped in old maps, which they still have in the back at YIVO. He was just doing everything he could to send this material. And his hope about it was that, it reflected the point of view of his mentors, of the Cherikovers. He's thinking, I need to prove the case against the Nazis, right? He didn't know, and the Yiddish press at that time was very worried that there would not be justice for what had happened to the Jews. As it turned out, the Nuremberg trials did cover many of the crimes against the Jews, though not all. But Szajkowski was very concerned about this, and he wanted the evidence to be in Jewish hands, right? And that's why he sent it to YIVO. So if we can make sense, and this is how I've made sense of what he was doing, of course, I should also tell you that what he was doing, like in this place, was completely illegal, okay? So another question that arises when thinking about this is, how could he do this on such a huge scale, take out so much stuff, and like nobody said anything? And to just give you a sense of how outrageous this was, this picture, I think, says it all. Because it proves that he wasn't sneaking around, right? Someone took this picture, right? Who took it? He's proud of it. He sent it home. Who took it? It must have been some other GI. He's not trying to hide what he's doing. He's proud of it. And not only did someone take this picture, but all of these papers that he took out, someone helped him drag them out. And how do you think they got to New York? Anybody have an idea?
U.S. Air Force.
Right, through the U.S. Post Office, right? So this means, right, the military has its own post. And he even said in some of these letters home, he said, "Thank you so much for writing back to me that you appreciate what I've sent you. It comes in really handy when I'm dealing with the censors." You know? So that means that he's had a conversation with the U.S. authorities who are going around their own regulations to let him do this. Why would they do this? Well, to understand that, I needed to look into what else was going on with stuff, with papers and books that the Allied forces were finding in Germany during liberation. And it turns out that Szajkowski was not the only man who was embarking on a salvage operation on behalf of the Jewish people in Germany in 1945. In fact, quite a number of illustrious Jewish scholars and political leaders got themselves to Germany in 1945 because of this other problem, which was that, as you may know, the Nazis, as part of their genocidal plans with regards to the Jews of Europe, they had also looted Jewish stuff, right? You may have heard about the art. That's probably the most famous case of this Jewish art that had been looted across Europe. But maybe you don't know that the Nazis had also looted Jewish furniture, musical instruments, Torahs, and millions of Jewish books had been looted from public Jewish, communal libraries, and also from Jewish private libraries, Jewish homes. And when the Allies actually, in 1943, they had caught wind of this, and they met in London, and they made a pledge, which was that they would send everything back to the people who it had been stolen from. I'm sure in 1945, when they learned that it was over 3 million books that they would find, they realized that the extent of the problem, of course, was much bigger than what they would ever have the resources to do, but they remained committed to it. So what they did in 1945 as they were finding all of these books was they simply piled them. Here's some pictures from the archives of how they dealt with Torah scrolls. So, an orderly stacking in advance of figuring out what to do with them. And then here they are bringing cartloads. They centralized everything in a town called Offenbach, which is near Frankfurt, where they found a huge warehouse that they could just put all the books in. So when Szajkowski's in Berlin, like going through all of this stuff and sending it to YIVO, meanwhile, the Allied authorities are dealing with all of these looted books. In 1945, the Allied authorities, before they sent anything back, they made their pledge, and this was their pledge. If we can't find the actual individuals who had this stuff taken from them, the actual victims, we have a plan B. And of course, you realize, like with the books, how are you going to figure out, except for big libraries, individual books, how are you going to figure out whose book this is? And of course, when we're talking about Jews in Europe who had, had their stuff looted, of course, many, many, many of them had perished. right? So Plan B is very important. And this was the Allied Plan B in 1945. Send it back to the country of origin and let them deal with it. Okay? Jews in New York were furious, especially the emigres. Their feeling was places that no longer had Jews in them should not be getting back all of these Jewish libraries. Think about the head of YIVO, now based in New York, Max Weinreich, what he must have thought. He's like, I got out of Vilna just in time. I don't want the YIVO library to go back to Vilna, where there's no one left to appreciate or take care of it. And yet that was the plan. Other Jews in New York, especially the kind of fierce anti-communist Jews in New York, were like also extremely worried about what would happen to the Jewish libraries that had been looted in the Soviet Union. What would happen? What would the Soviet Union do with Jewish books? And certainly, when they thought from their own self-interested point of view, they knew that Western Jews would never see these books again. So Szajkowski is one of many who was suspicious of how the Allies were planning to treat this. And while he is doing his own, undercover commando salvage operation in Berlin, Jews in New York are organizing to deal, and here's the archival depot, where they had all these books as they're sorting it out. To advocate to the Allies about what they wanted to do, Jews in New York, especially emigres, founded this organization called Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which lobbied the Allies to deal in a different way with the Jewish stuff. And by 1947, they had succeeded. So this organization was headed by this Jewish historian from Columbia University, Salo Baron, and its director of operations on the ground, the executive director, was Hannah Arendt. And their position was firm. Jewish things did not belong in places that did not have Jews. The Jewish books, even though Jews weren't in 1947 a sovereign nation, right? They didn't have a state. They argued that their organization, Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, should be treated like a state and should be given all of these books to distribute, and they won. They managed to convince the authorities, the Allied authorities, that they should take control of all of what were being called the orphaned books, the books where they couldn't figure out where to send them, that weren't easily identifiable. And they redistributed them to Jewish libraries, primarily in the United States, and then later also to Israel. European Jewish libraries got very little. And even there are cases, there's correspondence that I saw between Hannah Arendt and German Jewish survivors who were begging her, please leave our library in Germany, we're still here. Among the very few survivors, there were some who wanted to keep their libraries in Germany. And she said, no, you're very nice people and you're very well-meaning, but you have to understand that Jewish life in Europe is over. It's been dealt a total mortal blow. Even if there are surviving Jews, there's not the intellectual leaders. The rabbinate's been destroyed. So the books need to go where the people are, and they need to go where the intellectuals are, and that's New York. So why did I tell you this whole story? Because it's kind of on the side of the Szajkowski thing. Let me link it up to you. Our question was, why did the authorities in 1945 look the other way or even enable Szajkowski's taking stuff against regulations when it had to do with defense for the Jewish people? Well, it's because the Allied authorities were actually already sympathetic to this point of view. It fit very well with this general idea, Jewish things don't belong in Europe anymore, right? Even when the law didn't yet match up with this principle, actual soldiers on the ground were already starting to think that way. So Szajkowski wasn't the only one. And you hear so many stories. I've heard so many stories during this research of other, Jewish army chaplains who just abandoned their posts to go and help Jewish survivors or to go and help recover stolen Jewish stuff, right? And the idea that Europe was a vast graveyard and that reconstruction meant exodus, guided them in all of this work. And that's why in 1945, Szajkowski was hailed as a rescuer, even though what he did was illegal. But then we have a problem because, when the war ended, people like Hannah Arendt and Salo Baron stopped going to Europe to take books out. And Szajkowski kept going. And it's very hard when we're talking about 1947, 1950, 1955, 1961. It's very hard when you're thinking these dates, right? These much later dates. It's very hard to think Szajkowski's doing a salvage operation when he goes back, in his case, to France, to go to libraries, archives, and synagogues and remove Jewish papers and take them to YIVO in New York, right? It's very hard to see that as the same kind of salvage operation. So now we have to kind of turn our thinking to what is he up to in this time period. We know that his wartime reasoning that Jewish life in Europe is over, right, and you have to take everything out because there's no future for Jews in Europe, we know that he couldn't have thought that, right? Why do we know that? Well, even in 1947, so his first trip back to France, even in 1947, it would have been obvious to him that French Jewish life had not only survived the war, but it was actually reconstructing in place, and French Jews their numbers were actually growing, not shrinking, and that's because of immigration from Eastern Europe, right? Survivors coming out of Eastern Europe. By 1961, there's also an influx of North Africans. The French Jewish population by 1961 is actually larger than it was before the war. So he knows that this is a community that's reconstructing. And he knows that their synagogue survived. He knows that their synagogue library survived. And he knows that because he's actually going there, and these are the institutions that he's stealing from, right? How was he able to do it? This was one of the questions I had, right? How could he go into these places? Well, one example is illustrative, and I wanted to talk about, maybe some of you know this library, the Library of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was before the war, after the war, and even today, the largest Jewish library in Europe. And I found in the back of the Alliance, in their own internal correspondence of the library, librarians writing to each other saying like, hey, did you notice that book seems to have disappeared? I think Szajkowski did it. So they're suspecting him as early as 1947. How was it that he got away with continuing to steal from the Alliance for well over a decade, right? Why didn't they go to the police? This is an interesting story, and it actually tells you a lot about how he could do this. In 1947, the Alliance was in a strange position that made it difficult for them to go to the police. They had been looted, the entire library, which was 500,000 books, had been looted by the Nazis in July of 1940, right away. But then the entire collection was found by the Americans in Offenbach Archival Depot. So in 1947, that was actually the year that the Alliance got its entire collection. They were very fortunate. They got their entire collection back from Germany because the Americans sent it. The problem was, in 1947, when they suspected Szajkowski of stealing, they had gotten back all their books, but what they didn't get back was the card catalog. And it actually took until 1961 for volunteer librarians, these three. This woman worked in the Alliance Library until 1990, and you can still see her there frequently if you go there, the famous Madame Levine. They worked tirelessly in extra hours to reconstruct this card catalog. But in 1947, stuff was just sitting in the back on shelves. There was no way for them to go to the police and say, we're sure that this guy stole something. because they couldn't prove that they owned it. He took advantage of the chaos in Jewish institutions to steal from them. This is part of why the story is so horrible, right? This is part of what's so sad about the story. The other reason that they couldn't go to the police is less well documented, but it's obvious if you think about it. What French Jew wants to go to the police in 1947 and complain about a Jewish thief, right? This is not the kind of dirty laundry that you want to air in public. Anti-Semitism did not disappear overnight in France in 1944, right? There was still a lot of concern of keeping Jewish issues within the Jewish community. So what did they do instead? Well, they thought they had a really clever solution. And that was they found out from some friends in New York that these materials had been purchased by a library in New York called the Jewish Theological Seminary Library, the largest American Jewish library. They approached the librarian directly and said, "We believe you have some of our books." And they actually arranged to buy them back. The Americans were very generous and allowed these French librarians to, did I say, buy back their books. That's how you do it. And yet, so in this one case, the results are kind of mixed. They got their books back. But at the same time, because they never went to the police, the Jewish Theological Seminary continued to buy many books and documents from Szajkowski until his death in 1978. They kept doing it. And not just them, but many other American Jewish libraries. Hebrew Union College, Yeshiva University Library, eventually Brandeis University, Harvard University, New York Public Library, and in Israel, the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. Every Jewish library bought from Szajkowski. When you look at the evidence of its crimes, it's clear that his motives had evolved. Whereas earlier during the war, he was motivated by a desire to take things out of Europe, to rescue them for the sake of the Jewish people, now he's working against Jewish librarians, right? And it's only the money that can help us make sense of it. He was a scholar working outside of academia, unable to get a proper academic post because he didn't have the credentials. This was his way of supporting himself. And that money, of course, is only available where there are willing buyers. So now we must turn to the question of why they bought from him. So this is the last part of my talk about the libraries. And I want you to see here how, what these documents look like. So here's a document I found at the Jewish Seminary, at the Jewish JTS Library in New York. And it's remarkable. Okay, this is a 1790 document from Strasbourg. It's bilingual, you know, it's Revolutionary era. And it has this on it. This is Szajkowski's strange markings for his own idiosyncratic filing system. But do you notice anything else strange about it? Where, imagine you're a librarian. Surely there's some librarians here tonight. If someone came to you and said, I have this for sale, this rare document, what might make you think twice about buying this document? This, right? This is like missing part of the page. Is this the wear and tear of the ages? Is this the erosion? It's normal, you know, like yellowed paper. No, you said it exactly, right? This is the first page of a document, and often in the archives, there's an ownership stamp from the archives on the first page. So that's what, and the cut is so, this is a scissors, right? It might make you think like, gee, I wonder, where he got that. I wanted to show you a few other things. People often ask me like, how did you know that all this stuff was from Szajkowski? And so I thought I would just show you why I know. It's that he had a stamp. This is in Yiddish and it says Zion Szajkowski. That's his name. He stamped many of these documents. Okay? So it's a very strange kind of thief. You know, he obviously thought these belonged to him. He wasn't probably planning on selling them because this diminishes the value. And yet he did it. He also did this, wrote on these 19th century documents. he did this, like, I don't even know what this calculations and what this is. This is an early 20th century philanthropic organization. And then here again, the writing. This is his name in Yiddish. So these are what the documents look like. They're bought by every institution, and the question is, why? And I interviewed so many librarians that, you know, and the answers that they were giving me didn't make sense until I went and read just the basic mission statements of these libraries. And then it was like, I get it. These libraries have always, since they were founded in the early 20th century, these American Jewish research libraries, their mission was always, like every library, we're going to be the best library in the world. I'm spending the year in Oxford, and I'm getting to know the libraries there, and it's like the same thing, like we're going to be the best library in the world. We're going to have the most stuff. We're going to be the center for all of scholarship. And of course, the great libraries of the world are in a certain kind of competition with one another over this, right? This is the mission. But I want to add to this one special wrinkle for the Jewish libraries in the aftermath of World War II, and it's this. They're guided by the same ideas as Baron and Arendt, right? They believe very deeply, and they're right about this, that the Holocaust represents a massive sea change in Jewish history. It's the fall of one civilization and the rise of another. That's how they see it. They say, for centuries, Europe was the center of Jewish life, and it had great libraries, great rabbis, great seminaries. That's gone. Those German Jewish institutions are gone. Who will take their place? American Jews had always thought of themselves as kind of a backwater, and maybe here from England that seems obvious, right? Whenever I say this to Americans, they're like, wait, nuh-uh. It's like, yes, actually. American Jews understood that they were at the edge of the Jewish world, and they were actually, you know, American Jewry was founded by Jews who had fled Europe to get away from like the conservative rabbinate, and they were always less committed to scholarship than European Jews had been, and thought of the rabbinate as something that was more like, you know, pastoral, right? They emphasized that part. In the aftermath of World War II, that totally changed, and they came to believe that their libraries had to be the core of the core of learning for the future of Jewry, and they wanted their rabbis to have access to all of the stuff. So when Szajkowski approached them with this stuff, they're not fools, like they could see this, but it didn't matter to them, because what's their mission? Get it all in one place. They felt fortunate that this guy had approached them because they can take care of it and make it available, right? For them, they're thinking, what's the alternative? The alternative is it's not in a library, right? The alternative is it's lost forever. There, you know, JTS and also the other major seminary in America, Hebrew Union College, were the two greatest beneficiaries of Jewish cultural reconstruction's restitution process. They got a ton of stuff from Europe. They know that European Jewish things had been through a long chain of theft, rescue, and recovery. It didn't surprise them when a guy like Szajkowski, who had been a GI, approached them with stuff he had found on his own. They didn't ask questions, except how much do you charge for that, right? They saw it as a great opportunity to further their mission as a library. And it's ironic, right? Because they see themselves within this framework of rescue and reconstruction that they wind up becoming accomplices in the crimes of this scholar. So speaking of that, I want to conclude with some observations about the impact of Szajkowski's thefts. And for that, I need to make sure you have a clear view of his pattern of stealing and selling, because it's a little more complicated than I made it out to be. You can already see here that Szajkowski, these were working documents for him, right? He used these original documents in the same way that I or others in this room use Xeroxes or now digital photos. He writes all over them. He's using them for his research, right? And then when he was done with them, he sold them. But When he had gotten them from France, he might have gotten them all from, let's say he got them all from one institution. Say, this comes from the Paris synagogue, the main synagogue in Paris. So he would have gotten all of this. This comes from a file, I assume, the correspondence file of the Synagogue of Paris, the Consistoire de Paris. But when he got to America and after he used it, instead of selling all the stuff that he got from the Paris synagogue to one place, like, say, the New York Public Library, instead he sold maybe one letter to Brandeis, another letter to Israel, a third letter to Harvard, so that it's all dispersed now. In order to put together a story, a simple story, now you have to travel like to Cincinnati, to Jerusalem, to Paris, because of course there's stuff left behind. This is actually the part that scholars get really upset about, right? The scholars are like, what? How could you? We depend on the logic of the archive. We expect that the archive is going to have everything together that was produced by one person. Now it's scattered. He's a historian. Didn't he have any scruples? Why would he do that? Does anybody have any thoughts about that? I'm always curious. It's
the expert.
Yeah, that it's for his own, right? That it's him. Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. And then there's also something, you got to be thinking like a businessman. So put on your businessman cap. Why is this better business?
Selling them individually.
Yeah. Okay, so if you have 3 documents and you sell them all to one person, they're going to want a discount, right? So 3 for $10, whereas you could sell them each individually for $5. And these are the numbers we're talking about, by the way. He got, very little. So to make more money, you have to separate it out. It's not the logic of the archive, it's the logic of the businessman that determined this setup. So in this sense, what he did was very destructive to French Jewish history because he scattered our documents all over. And yet, the long-term effects are a little more complicated than that, because I should also add that institutions like this, the Paris Synagogue, when Szajkowski stole from them, it wasn't an archive. It was just a synagogue. And somehow he had managed to get his way into the back that no one else had ever tried, or maybe they tried and just couldn't get back there. This stuff that he stole, no one was ever working on it because no one had seen it. When he decided to sell these documents to Jewish research libraries, then all of a sudden they're available. Sure, they're scattered, but it's only in the wake of those sales that we start to see dissertations produced in universities in French Jewish history. And it's people working at the very institutions that collected these documents. So it's like Brandeis University, Columbia University. That's where people are working on the stuff. So in a sense, his sales start the field in motion. Now you might be saying, because we're so close to France, maybe you're thinking, well, but what about from the French perspective? Didn't he make that impossible? As one person in France said to me, an archivist, he said, he stole our memory, right? But actually, when you look at the history, it's more complicated. Because it was only in the wake of these thefts and when they discovered them in the early 1960s that French Jewish historians, so by this I mean actually historians who live in France, who are of French nationality, who happen to be Jewish, formed an organization to protect and make available Jewish records. So they started going into synagogues like this one and cataloging. This synagogue now has an archive that I was using where I learned about Szajkowski's thefts. That archive didn't exist before Szajkowski. So in a sense, his thefts enable and create the field of French Jewish history in France as well. Because if you look again at the dates of the first dissertations, it's in the 1970s in the wake of these cataloging projects. So to conclude, our thoughts are all mixed up, right? Because the legacy of Szajkowski is ultimately ambiguous. Let's get a good picture of him to think about him. On the one hand, this is a story of theft, right? His buyers thought they were rescuing Jewish history, and yet they were buying from a thief. And yet, okay, if we're going to turn that around again, even though the thief's intentions were selfish and his actions criminal and likely pathological, the effects of what he did were ultimately productive, laying both the material and intellectual foundations of French Jewish history. So it's not just Szajkowski's work as a scholar that makes him a founding father of French Jewish history. It's also his work as an archive thief. Thank you.
If I forgot to say at the start, I'll say now, thank you very much, Lisa. I'll thank you again at the end, but that was a magnificent lecture. Thank you. What I forgot to say at the beginning was that Lisa will take questions, and I'll get out of the way and let her do just that.
Thank you. Are there questions? Yes, in the back. Yeah.
How much was that?
Oh, sorry, I forgot. I'm supposed to wait for the microphone.
How much of his activity was affected by the rising political situations in the 30s?
Oh, so much of it. So I should signal that this man is next, and maybe I'll answer your question while she's walking. So much of his interest in history was a response to what he was seeing in the 30s. And it's very interesting tracing what he thought about the communists, right? Because first he had thrown in his lot with the communists, and then he starts saying, you know, there was a Jewish subsection of the Communist Party in France, and it was, and I mean all over, but in France it was going to deal with anti-Semitism as well as the class issue. And what he saw in 1937 was that they were backing off of any kind of special treatment of Jews. And this is part of why he's like, we have to respond as a people to this. The Jewish politics is more important to me than the class politics, or they're so interrelated that there's no way to abandon this. So his turn to history is a turn against communism as a response to fascism. You know what I mean? He's saying this situation is so extreme that we need a response, and this is the most powerful response. And it also kind of affects what he's up to I think, in the 50s too, because you see in his correspondence when he goes back to France in the 50s, he's a little bit upset with the wider politics, but most of his ire is directed at the Jewish communists. You know, he's like, if there's anyone that he's stealing this from in the 50s, it's the Jewish communists. He's like, I've got to get these papers away from the Jewish communists. And those are very old battles that, you know, they seem almost silly to us today, unless maybe, you know, BDS Zionists, maybe it's that kind of passion that shaped so much of his politics and his devotion to scholarship.
Thank you very much for a really exciting presentation. Worthy really of a British radio program called The Moral Maze. The ethical questions, the moral questions are profound behind this case. And I think that's probably best illustrated with the title of your book, because you've got two words in it. One is thief, and the other is salvaged. Salvaged from whom is my question.
Yeah.
And it may be of interest to you as a sort of counterpoint to your lecture. I forget the author, I forget the name of the book, but it's reviewed in the last issue of the London Review of Books about state complicity in the destruction of archives by the British authorities as they withdrew from their former colonies.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, one of the kind of fields of scholarship that I was interested in connecting with is all the people who are doing work on archives today. And there's so many fascinating stories about archive destruction. Gosh, I just saw the most interesting presentation about the papers of Vichy, like of the Vichy government, being thrown out the window of the ministries at the moment of liberation. You know, they were just like, we've got to get away from this stuff. So there are all these stories about destruction, but I also found so many stories about stuff being saved. And I mean, the Jews in Paris in the during the war, so like in 1940, 41, burying their papers underground, hiding them. The Paris synagogue hid its papers in the walls of the Rothschild chateau. It's like, wow. So, it's amazing how powerful these papers are and how they've been treated and what we can get out of them. And then a word about the title. So you're so kind to have appreciated that I put that in the title. Most people assume that my publisher forced me to do this and didn't quite understand. But I think for me, the point of this whole story, of my telling of the story, is that there's a real ambiguity in these actions, and we can't simply say it was good or bad. Like many things in history, there's positive and negative effects. And, we're luckily at a time where it's safe enough to think about both of those aspects of it. Okay, so I'm going to get a group of you, and maybe we'll work 1, 2, 3, 4. That means I have to remember, so I should get a pen. Okay.
Thanks. I'm interested as to why somebody who spent much of his adult life brazenly stealing documents would eventually commit suicide because he was caught stealing documents. What was it about that final episode that affected him so much?
Great. And then now François.
Yes, I would like to ask you to connect this activity which you have described with his scholarship. Because when you discussed your book, I told you that I had known about the story of the thief, and I had known Szajkowski as an author, whom I very much appreciated, but I had never connected the two aspects. And his scholarship is actually very interesting because it's extremely dynamic. He's very critical. He's a very critical author. He's very critical of establishments. So how he writes about the various alliances in the 19th century is extremely critical. It's good critical scholarship. Yeah. How do you connect this? I mean, is there a kind of revolt against the establishment behind it? Also behind the stealing?
Yeah. Great.
We'll try one more, and if it still squeaks, I'll turn the mic down.
I'm very interested actually to know about his personal papers, because you've got a huge amount of biographical material there which he clearly didn't destroy. So there's no shame in the man at all.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe I'll... one more.
I think I'd rather wait for your answer and then ask them.
Yeah? Okay, and you'll be the first of the next group? Okay. Why did he commit suicide? He was really caught red-handed and they had a police sting operation and they had set up a camera. So he was going to go to jail. And the New York Public Library was the center of this man's existence. It was the most important place for him, where he did all of his work. So it was really clear, one consequence for sure was going to be he would never be let back in the library that was the center of his life. He also worked at YIVO. He worked there straight through from he worked there mostly since 1946. And they knew, everybody knew. There were certain places that he hadn't been allowed in, actually, because there'd always been rumors about him. But what this meant for YIVO was that they weren't going to be able to justify keeping him on anymore. So he was going to lose his job, and he was going to lose access to libraries. So this meant what's the point of living? I also heard a very sad story when the police took him back to his apartment to see if they were very curious, as I'm sure someone here is going to ask, was there stuff in his apartment when he died? Someone always asks that, so I'll just answer that. No, there was nothing there, but what they found there was his wife, who may or may not have known, but you can imagine the amount of shame. And I think there's an element of recognition that what he did was wrong. On the one hand, yeah, he's brazen, he's shameless. On the other hand, this is an act of shame, the suicide. Okay, so that's the first question. Second question is about the scholarship, which I spend a lot of time on in the book, but already my talk is way too long, so I had to cut it out here. But I have a lot of thoughts about this. The scholarship is very critical, and it's also very much bottom up. So he's a social and economic historian, and if any of you works in Jewish history, You know how unusual this is in his era? Jewish scholarship had been dominated by people who wrote about rabbis and intellectuals, partially because of sources. He was interested in ordinary people. Like his anti-elitism, his communism from back in the day led him to be interested in ordinary people. But that required a kind of sources that you just don't have in New York. You know what I mean? It's not like old Haggadahs or tracts by famous rabbis. You've got to go to strange places to find these. So it is related. His desire to do this different kind of history means that with no money, because he's got no job, he's got to go all across France just by himself, finding sources about ordinary people. The other thing is he's obsessed with the sources. I mean, something that people tend to say, that very established university professors tend to say about Szajkowski's work is like, yeah, it's good, it's all true, but it's kind of amateurish. Like he doesn't have arguments. He doesn't have big arguments, you know, like we want, like we're supposed to be writing. And this is also part of his point, I think. It's not by accident, it's not from lack of training, it's a choice. And I think it's because he believes that everything, all the big questions in Jewish history, and the ones that he's most interested in are about like modernity, just big question. Like, is it good for the Jews to become citizens? Is it good for Jews to assimilate? Is it good for Jews to abandon separatism? And he feels like in the post-Holocaust world, we don't know the answer to that. We need to look at the sources. We can't bring a preordained conclusions to that. So that's part of why many of his books, and again, this is back to the archive, are just presentations of documents. And his final books, he published between 1977 and 78, 4 books, okay? And all of those books, they look like coffee table books. They're big books of reproductions of documents in 6 languages. You know, no one could read this. He doesn't explain what they are. But it's like, I'm putting the evidence before you. It's the same passion for the documents that inspires his stealing. Okay, personal papers. He did not leave personal papers at all. There are collections called Zosa Szajkowski at YIVO and at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it's just drafts of articles, unfortunately. So what I did was I looked in other people's papers. And it was in the Cherikover papers, actually, that I found this amazing trove of letters from the wartime. But one of the weaknesses of the book is that I have very little of that from the 1950s and 60s, and I have to fill in with very spotty letters where I don't have him saying, you know, here's how I feel and all that. But I do have that when he is so close to the Cherikovers. Okay, now you.
Yes, it's all was the previous personal questions, and my question is about the moral background. I was thinking about a lot of things came into my mind, how immoral was the world in his time, and not perfect, you know, and not just the Germans killing the Jews, which was not really morally right, and the politics, but the state kind of immorality is that, you know, the Jews didn't get back their money from the English or the French,
right?
Because they were alive. So there was so many hurt had the Jews. And the other thing, I grew up in a socialist country, and there was a saying that if you don't steal from your workplace, it's stealing from your family. So yeah. I think I'm sorry for him, and I think about what a moral atmosphere was and is in the world. And academics, I hear about that, who have professors take out books, again, especially in a socialist country where there were not many books. There was one book in the whole country, and the professor took it out and didn't let anyone else to read it because he wanted to be the best experts. Yeah. And this kind of, I just like to.
Yeah, I mean, those
moral
are
background, and you know, I like to forgive him, but it's not easy.
No, those are very important points of comparison. Okay, let's get a few more and then do some observations here.
Yeah, I'm interested in the moral indignation that's coming out in this room in the year 200 and whatever we are. I noticed that he was a Polish Jew who escaped during 1941 from Paris. And during that period, it was not the French Jews who were being deported, it was the Polish Jews.
That's right.
And the French Jews were quite happy for them to go. So, you know, he must have also, you know, the history was as much his as the French Jews who considered themselves French, not Jews. And I think we have to, as they say, you know, walk a mile in someone's shoes before you start judging them.
Yeah. And then let's get Daniel on the aisle.
I've read a few pieces by him, and I think, you know, what I've read has been of a really, really good quality. And I suppose other people, I think Francois mentioned that sometimes, you know, you don't know who the author is when you're reading this piece. So I'm just curious, out of everything that he's written, and, you know, he has written a lot, what pieces are, you know, the most quoted pieces by him? You know, which pieces have really made their mark on scholarship? You know, be it French Revolution or Vichy or whatever, because, you know, his breadth was just extraordinary.
Yes. Okay, let me get these three. So the first two questions are looking at things more from his point of view. And of course I do that. I mean, I just gave you like the most sympathetic portrayal of him. That's why you're reacting like this, right? I also want to say it's complicated because there were lots of Polish Jews who wanted to be scholars and could never make it in the academy. And, you know, most of them, many of them were associated with YIVO, and he interacted with them every day. So people in situation parallel to his who didn't become archive thieves and who didn't have this kind of reaction to what he went through. So it's not like it necessarily produces this. But that being said, I think this is exactly how we understand, right, his background, what he went through. And then this extraordinary period that you mentioned where law and justice did not map onto one another. And many Jews, not just Szajkowski, got used to acting outside of the law to do what they saw as just. And I think Holocaust stories like this, we're not used to hearing them, but once you bring it up and once you start looking around, it's like, oh yeah. You know, it's like those partisans who never came out of the woods in some ways. He keeps on living in this extraordinary moment. And then in answer to Daniel about what works are the most influential of his more than 200 works in many different fields, I would say, for your sake, because you asking the question, the Analytical Franco-Jewish Gazetteer, is that what it's called? Yeah, Analytical Franco-Jewish Gazetteer. Szajkowski was one of the first to do Holocaust history of what happened to the Jews in France. And he was in a privileged position to do it because I told you he stole all the documents. Not stole, took at a moment where they were unowned. And he spent over 20 years working on this book while he had other things going on. And what he came up with was an introduction, which is a short article in which he says it's too soon to know really what happened. It's only been 20 years, but what I'm going to give you instead is a bibliography in the form of a gazetteer, so arranged by town, of every document that will allow us to tell the story. And this has been an invaluable resource, and it's unbelievable that he was able to put this together in the 50s and early 60s at a time when people only knew about what had happened in Paris. He wrote to all the departments of France to find out what they might have. And what did he find? Simply by this, I think the finding of the gazetteer, even though he won't say it, because he won't make conclusions, but it's obvious, which is how did Jews in France survive? By running into every tiny hamlet, right? He found Jews in the tiniest of hamlets. And they hadn't been living there in the 30s, right? French Jews saved themselves by going out into the countryside and getting themselves hidden. And he is the one who started that. This is what we say now, like a Holocaust historians like Daniel Lee. This is what we say about why French Jews survive in such higher numbers than elsewhere, including the Polish Jews who did survive, right? They were hit in much harder numbers, but the ones who did survive, so many of them left Paris to do so and hid in the countryside. And this is the discovery that he makes in the Gazetteer and makes it possible for us to write about it. And there are other important works, but I think that's maybe the most interesting to know about. Okay, there's a bunch in the back. We'll get those both.
You said that, I quote, Nuremberg covered most of the crimes. Well, the billionaire German scholar Jan Philipp Brinkmars commented on the symbolic quality of Nuremberg, and we see that it wasn't until the early 60s that people like Bauer in Frankfurt were able to put on the Auschwitz trial, which created a turn in German life, that there were any significant trials, and we're still having trials for the people who actually committed the crimes, not the Schreibtischtäter, the desk perpetrators, but the people who actually committed the crimes. So I cannot agree with your judgment on Nuremberg.
Okay, thank you.
What's happened since? Have the French synagogues and libraries tried to get documents back? You showed us ones where they clearly couldn't because the signs had gone, and others where they could. And what's been the response from the US?
Yeah, great. Okay, so I'll take both of those now because you're in the same place. About Nuremberg, I mean, I think the Israelis felt exactly the same way, that even though at Nuremberg there was like trial of the Einsatzgruppen, trial for medical experiments, that the thrust of Nuremberg was war crimes, crimes of aggression, and that doesn't capture the experience of the Jews. That's not a trial for a crime against the Jewish people, and that's why the Israelis, why in part they wanted to have their own trial to frame this as crimes against the Jewish people. So I think you're right, but of course, many of the crimes against the Jews were part of that war of aggression. And I think that if Szajkowski had known, and if the Yiddish press had known in 1945 what the actual charges would be, they would not have been quite so upset with the Allies as they were. Second question is about what happened since, and that's very interesting, which is basically nothing. A lot of outrage, of course. In 1972, so a lot of stuff you won't believe it because I talked for so long, but a lot of stuff was not in this talk that actually happened in the book. And in 1961, Szajkowski was arrested in France, and that means that the French knew. And in 1972, a guy, a French Jewish historian based in Israel named Simon Schwarz-Fuchs, showed up in New York, and he said, I come to you on behalf of the French Jewish archives. I know what you have. I know why you have it. And I want you to make 2 microfilms. One for the French, which will be held at the Alliance Library, that big library, and the other for the Israelis, where he happened to be based. And that really solved a lot of the, there's still a lot of big talk of outrage, but the microfilm solution solves so much of it, right? In a practical sense, we have a solution where people everywhere, there are 3 copies. The truth of the matter is, when I was writing this book, a number of librarians in France said to me, oh, Lisa, we're so glad you're writing this book. Make sure at the end of the book you have a table that lists all the documents he stole, where he got them from, where they are now. Did I mention tens of thousands of documents? Probably. So they were like, Lisa, this will be easy for you. At the end of the book, just make a table, what he stole, where it's from, and where it is now, and then we'll turn it over to our government, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then we'll get it all back. And I couldn't do that. It would have been a totally different book, and I also think it's just impossible. And I also think there's no library right now in France or the US or in Israel that's actually in a position to take this many. It is incredibly expensive and difficult to keep these collections. I mean, those American Jewish librarians who said to me, I'm so happy we have this stuff because we are some of the only institutions in the world with the money to take care of it and make it available, even though in a way they're just self-justifying, they're also right about that this is an incredibly expensive endeavor, and none of the libraries that I've talked about today are doing very well financially right now. They're all in crisis. JTS is selling off parts of their collection. The Allianz just sold its building and they're moving the library off-site. So if they received this stuff back, it's not a moment where they could take care of it in spite of all the big talk. Okay, any other questions? Yes, one last.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Would you consider that these documents that he's stolen have archival value themselves?
So they have archival value, like they tell us a lot, you know, they're historically very useful. But one thing that's interesting about them and makes him interesting is that most people who steal from archives are in it to make a lot of money. Like the kinds of things you normally read about when you have a big like scandal is like people stealing things with the signature of the Queen, you know, or something like that. Something that when you sold it, you would make a lot of money. But these, you saw them. This is not worth a lot of money. These are like 19th century, just regular papers of lowly institutions. And he's selling them for $5 a pop. So they don't, that makes him a very unusual archive thief. Normally people are going after big value items. And this is part of why I contend he stole them for his research. Then he sold them for money. But he didn't go in there. You know, there were things in these archives that were truly valuable, like medieval manuscripts. He didn't go near those. He was a historian and a thief. Okay, that's it. Thank you all.
Before you go, I'd like to thank Lisa on behalf of us all for a really scintillating lecture. I mean, it was an extraordinary piece of investigation, but also work which explored extremely difficult moral, ethical issues, but also threw light on how history is actually constructed and put together. Really, it's been a remarkable achievement, Lisa. Those of you who want to learn and read more, The Archive Thief is published by Oxford University Press, and I am sure is available from all good bookshops and websites. Anyway, Lisa, thank you very much indeed once again.